Okay, so it's just 10 o'clock, so people will keep filtering in, but we just want to welcome everyone to this morning's Open Research Office, and I'm going to let our presenters introduce themselves.
Sure. So actually, uh, Marshall, I'm going to share my screen real quick if you don't mind. There we go. Great. So good morning, everyone. My name's Connor Flynn. Just quickly skimming through the names on here, I'm pretty sure 50 to 75% of you have already worked with me in some capacity. So it's good to see you all again. I am, as of yesterday, actually, the new director of research contracts for our sponsor programs office at UB. Jennifer Mandina is the contracts group lead for our technology transfer office. I'm not sure if she's logged in yet. If she has, chime in. She did have some office issues this morning, and she may not be able to attend. So we'll cover her portions to the best of our ability, and then I will let my colleague Alex introduce himself as well.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Vorachevsky. I'm with Procurement Services, and later I'll be talking about submitting contracts, research-funded contracts through ShopBlue.
Hey, thanks, Alex. So, I always love doing this. Uh, I'm sure that many of you come to all the CTSI Open Research Office uh, uh, presentations, but just by a show of hands, I would love to see, how many people know right now that there are excuse me, at least three different research contract offices at the university. Good. So I see some hands go up. That's okay. How many knew that as 2 months ago there were actually four? And then finally, I'd love to understand better from this group. How many people know um, who they should go to with a question about contracts? Just no question to know exactly who to go to with a question about contracts. Great. So we are not gonna solve all of these issues right now, but the point here of this presentation is to get us headed in the right direction. So as we said earlier, my name's Connor Flynn. I'm Director of Research Contracts for Sponsor Program Services or Sponsor Project Services. We handle mostly government and nonprofit agreement, but we also handle industry and federal clinical research agreements, as well as health sciences, MTAs, DUAs, and NDAs. Jennifer in the tech transfer office, they handle primarily industry sponsored research agreements, services agreements, testing agreements, IP, uh, commercialization, and non-health sciences MTAs and NDAs. So big picture, if you think of something as federal or if it's a clinical trial, it's going to be routed to SPS. If and then if it's industry, except when it's an industry sponsored clinical trial, it's most likely going to go to tech transfer. That's sort of the rule of thumb to use in the back of your head. And then Alex, as he outlined earlier, he's going to be handling goods. Well, not him personally, but his office will be handling goods and services procurement for research purposes. So as far as our offices are organized, both SPS and Tech Transfer are within the overall umbrella of the Vice President for Research and Economic Development. Purchasing and contract services reports up through the Vice President for Finance and Administration. There is not a specific, we're definitely going to handle certain agreements all the time, but general rules of thumb, sponsored research agreements will be handled by SPS or tech transfer usually. Um, uh, Federal foundation clinical trials versus industry sponsored. Um, in general, as I said earlier, SPS is going to handle uh, the federal and foundation agreements, as well as the clinical trials, regardless of funder. And then tech transfer is going to handle the balance of industry sponsored research agreements. Uh, uh, Clinical trial agreements, SPS will ensure compliance with both UB policies, research foundation policies, and will handle those types of agreements regardless of funder. And that's actually something new. For a long time, clinical trial agreements were handled by the clinical research office. Then for a period, they were handled by the vice president for health sciences. Part of the move part of some of the changes that we just underwent before I started is that clinical research agreements are not handled by their own office anymore. They're now part of a larger office within sponsored programs handling sponsored research agreements. Material transfer agreements, when you want to move some things from one location to another, usually that's biological material. Sometimes it's non-biological material, but most of the ones that we see are for biological material. Those agreements are going to be handled by SPS for health sciences. General rule of thumb, if there's an IRB required, that agreement is probably going to be handled by sponsored programs, and tech transfer for anything that does not have to do with an IRB and is non-health sciences. For data use agreements, this is a very, very hot topic at the university right now. And when I say university, I don't just mean UB, I mean the university statewide. The sharing and receipt of data, I know, is very, very important to many of the research projects that all of you are working on. When that data is moved from one location to another, say when it's moved from a hospital to here, when it's moved from a practice plan to here, when it's moved from here to another university, say, there in general should be a data use agreement covering that transfer. How those are handled, I think, is an evolving question. We've seen a fairly large spike in the number of DUAs that have been submitted to our office over the past, I'd say, year or two. It's really increased rapidly. So we need to come up with a good plan for how those are handled, what party signs on those, what sign-offs are required, so that we can streamline that process. That's going to be one of the first things that I'm working on in this new position. Non-disclosure agreements. If there's a non-disclosure agreement for a clinical trial, that NDA will be handled by SPS. Virtually every other non-disclosure agreement that would be considered by the university is going to be related generally to an industry sponsored project or something to do with IP. So everything that doesn't, more or less everything that doesn't have to do with the clinical trial is going to be handled by our technology transfer office. Licensing and intellectual property agreements, that's pretty straightforward. When you need some sort of an agreement to either bring, we don't do this as much, but bring some sort of technology or intellectual property into the university, much more often it is pushing intellectual property out of the university and into established companies, into startup companies. Those agreements, the expertise for those lies within tech transfer, and that's who will be managing the agreement. And then finally, purchasing agreements. So when you're working on a project and you need to buy stuff, you need to buy equipment, you need to buy services, you need to buy anything. That agreement to purchase those services, such as a software license, for example, that's going to be handled by Alex's group in a procurement.
Connor?
Yeah.
Just quickly, on that list, I'm wondering about collaboration agreements. So they're not funded, but they're a collaboration agreement. Maybe that can be added next time. Would that just go to SPS, or I don't know. I just didn't see it listed.
Yeah. So you are.
Hey,
So
Connor,
Michelle
can I
and I
talk
did
on this
not
one?
plan this. Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, so collaboration agreements. If they're with nonprofits, they go to SPS. If they're with for-profits,
If they're for profits, I think Jennifer was saying that.
yeah, so they go to tech transfer. Somehow my audio turned off, surprisingly. Okay, yeah. So for-profits go to tech transfer, but the whole point is if they put it in Click, it will get routed to the appropriate person. If there's a question about it, SPS and tech transfer will discuss it first, and then it'll be assigned to the right person. So from the PI perspective, it's seamless as long as it's entered into Click.
Thanks, Jennifer.
So Michelle, what I was and welcome, Jennifer. I'm glad that your office is okay. So Michelle and I did not plan this out, but this was actually perfect timing because the very next slide is about the collaborative workflow between offices. So as Jennifer just said, I just want to confirm if it is a research related agreement and it's submitted to Click, we have a very tight working relationship with technology transfer, who's actually just downstairs from our office. Many of us interned or worked for tech transfer over the years. Myself, Ryan, Michelle included in that group. So we have a very good relationship in terms of determining who is going to actually handle an agreement. And in those cases where it's sort of in a gray area or could go either way, we have a good way to work through that. Alex is included in that group as well. When sometimes we will get the odd procurement related agreement submitted through Click. That's not really a big deal. We see it, we flag it, and we get it over to procurement so that they can handle it and then communicate with the PI as well. But something that's important to understand is that not even only on complex agreements, but larger agreements are often going to contain different clauses that might need to be reviewed by individual offices. So we have to collaborate just as a matter of fact on an agreement by agreement basis. For example, clinical research agreements, especially investigator initiated clinical trial agreements. Sometimes we'll have to have or we'll have to bring in the technology transfer office to take a look at some of the IP terms, because whereas for the industry sponsored clinical research agreements, we don't care that much about the IP. There's not really IP that comes out of them anyway. There's been a statewide decision that we're not going to push hard on the IP for those. But when you flip that and you have our own investigators who are getting funds from a sponsor, from the NIH, to design their own clinical trials, well, that IP could be very valuable. So we often need to consult with the technology transfer office to make sure that the language we have in the agreement to accept the funding is going to protect our IP appropriately. And then also there are terms often within our larger research agreements about how goods and services will be purchased in the course of the research. We in those cases will have to bring in procurement to make sure that those terms are okay, because that's not something that we have a ton of experience with. We have a very good relationship between our offices, and as long as the agreement is submitted in the correct location as early as possible in the process, we have a very good way of making sure that these agreements get handled. Jennifer or Alex, did you have anything to add to that before we move on to the next slide?
No, I think that's really perfect, Connor. And thank you for mentioning that a lot of times our offices collaborate on certain provisions of contracts. For example, like intellectual property, or whenever we're purchasing something, but there's an intellectual property component, we regularly collaborate with tech transfer, RF counsel, in various departments throughout UB. So thank you for mentioning that.
And that's that. I mean, that is what we're here for. This is part of the administrative aspect of the services that UB provides to investigators, faculty, and study teams. Like, there's a lot of work that goes in negotiating every agreement, whether that's for the purchase of services or to conduct a research study. As Alex mentioned, sometimes you have to follow up with RF counsel. Sometimes you have to follow up with SUNY counsel. There's a lot of boxes that need to be checked. We are here to serve faculty and study teams and to make that process go smoother. So not only do we maintain a collaborative experience, or a collaborative work environment between the offices, it's also important that we maintain a collaborative environment with the faculty and study teams that we serve. Jennifer, do you have anything?
I'm in a hallway. I'm trying to keep my conversation.
Jennifer, I'm sorry. Okay, as long as you're safe, good. So using electronic systems for agreements and amendments. So there are two different systems that will both cover. Let's check time real quick. Yes, we're fantastic on time. There are two different systems to use when submitting an agreement or an amendment to an agreement for review by you by someone at UB. And that question is going to turn on: is this an agreement for to conduct research, or is this an agreement to buy something? That's sort of the question that should be hanging out in the back of your head to determine where this should be submitted. And don't worry if it's submitted at the wrong place. As I just said in the last slide, if it is submitted in the wrong place, we have a good relationship with the other offices, and we will get it figured out. But for the fastest review time, it's best to submit it in the right place. So for sponsored projects and tech transfer agreements, for research agreements, those should be created and submitted through the Click portal. I'll show you. I'll give a quick overview of how to do that, and then I'll also give a quick example of how you can actually track the progress to know where something is at. And then Alex is going to show you some points about the Shop Blue procurement process. So there are trainings on this. This should not be treated as the be all and end all for training on how to use Click agreements. There's actually a link towards the end of this presentation that there's a little QR code that will take you to a training program provided by Tracy Groves and Research Information Systems. So you can do this much better than I can. But just at a very high level, what do you need to do to get an agreement reviewed? Historically, it's been a little all over the place. So for clinical research agreements, it's if it's for a clinical trial or for a clinical research project, that's getting submitted to central study registration. The clinical research office is then putting it into Click on your behalf. And then if it was clinical research related, like an NDA, the clinical research group always asked that those agreements be submitted to Click. Tech transfer, I think, historically has accepted agreements through Click agreements as well. That was the case
Since
when I
the
was there. I
beginning of
think
Click, we have accepted agreements through Click.
right. So that is the place to go for tech transfer agreements. For SPS, it's been a little bit of a different setup. Many agreements have been submitted through email. Many agreements have been submitted via various other methods. There's been no official communication on this yet. The contracts team knows about this, but the direction that we're moving in is that agreements are going to be submitted through Click. So it should be easier for faculty in that respect. So you're not having to figure out, well, if this is a tech transfer agreement, I put it through Click. If it's not a tech transfer agreement, I send it through email to the specific person. The future state over the next few weeks to 2 months is that we're transitioning to submitting all agreements through Click agreements if it's research related, and then we will handle on the back end between tech transfer and sponsored projects who's going to handle which agreement. We have good marching rules already. If there is a gray area, we will handle it on a case by case basis.
Oh, Connor, there are two questions.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, go
So
ahead.
there's one in the chat that says, can we put an agreement into Click before the study is entered via central study registration?
Okay, so this is something I'm guessing that this is related to clinical research because central study registration is brought up. So I'll defer to Kim and Pam on this for an official answer, but my answer based on my experience working with them is if it's an agreement to conduct a project, it should be submitted through central study registration rather than Click as of right now. If it is like an NDA, if if a company sends you an NDA for your faculty member to learn more about a clinical trial that the company is doing, that should be submitted to directly to Click Agreements. So really the only time that you should ever be going through central study registration rather than Click is when it is an agreement to conduct a study. Does that answer your question? I can't see the chat, so.
Yeah, it's me, Mary. Yeah,
Hi, Mary.
because sometimes we get the agreements and like you say, we have to have the NDA in place before they even give us anything. So usually the CTAs come through pretty first. Yeah. So yeah, you answered my question. Thank you.
Good. And one thing I'll add to that is something that we'll see. I wish I could just say sometimes, but we see it all the time. As far as clinical research is concerned, that NDA for the university to receive information about the clinical trial, that has to be submitted to Click, and it needs to be reviewed by the appropriate office. Sometimes we'll see faculty or staff signing off on those NDAs. I'm not sure the reason why, but it those need to be reviewed by the university and need to be submitted by through a Click. And I also see 2 raised hands.
Yeah, so one, Kim just answered and said that is correct. If a CTA is submitted outside of CSR, it will be voided and entered through CSR. 2, before we get to you, Mohammed, Marcel did have their hand up. Did you want to answer your question? Or ask your question? You put your hand down. I don't know if it was answered already. Okay, so maybe their question was answered. Go ahead. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Okay. Yes, it was the same question, so I apologize. I lower my hand.
Oh, that's okay. Okay, go ahead, Mohammed.
Thank you. So, Connor, I just wanted to confirm what you said. So, if it's okay, so you said research agreement to just do a project. I'm not sure what that is, but for example, if I'm a researcher at a university, I have another colleague who's another researcher at another university, and we want to do a project together because we have similar data sets. So, would that go directly to Click first, or the central study register that as register that as a study, have that RB approved, and then start the agreement process?
So I will defer to Kim on that one as well, because the central study registration process works a little bit outside of my scope. I'll say that if there are, well, just using the example that you used, if you and a collaborator at another university want to exchange data sets with one another, most of the time the exchange of that data is going to require some form of data use agreement. So if it is usually if the data is going out from us to someone else, we will draft the data use agreement. If it's coming in to us from another location, they will draft the agreement. Really, all that changes for you, well, not you specifically, just whoever is on the study team. That agreement needs to be submitted to Click Agreement. So somebody's sending you an agreement, a draft agreement for them to send information to you, that needs to be submitted to Click Agreements as a DUA so that it can be reviewed. If you want to send information somewhere else, that should also be submitted to Click Agreements as a DUA. You should check the box that says, we don't have a draft agreement yet. You will need to draft one. There's that we're not going to get too in deep with that, but yes, there does need to be an agreement. And then Marshall, has Kim responded in the chat that I can't see?
Yeah, she said if it comes through CSR, we will initiate or help with getting the DOA into agreements.
So Mohammed, does that answer your question?
Yes. So yes, Kim did answer my question. Thank you so much, Connor.
Okay, so any more questions before we get rolling on Click? Not seeing any right now. Just raise your hand in Zoom, and Marcel's done a great job of flagging those. So just at a very high level, as I said, if you want a more in-depth review on on how to use Click Period or Click Agreements, Tracy Groves, and in Research Information Systems is going to be your main point of contact. She has a great training program for all these systems. But to submit any sort of agreement, you log into Click through the Click Agreements module. You create a new agreement. You click on the new agreement button. You fill out the necessary smart forms with details about the agreement, such as the type of contract and the parties involved. Please attach any relevant documents that you can. The more information that you give contracts managers to review, the more specific your responses are in the smart form, the quicker it's going to be to get that contract reviewed. Oftentimes I will see when something is submitted that there'll just be vague information in there about what it's needed for, and that causes it causes the contracts manager to then have to investigate, okay, what is this for? Why are we doing this? Sometimes they'll start the contract and it'll go in one direction, but actually the faculty or study team wanted the contract for a different sort of scope or purpose. Then we kind of have to start over. So the more detail that you can provide at the outset, the more documentation you can provide at the outset, the better. Once you have gone through the smart form, answered the questions, and attached any relevant documents, then you will submit for review. If you have any questions about what to do in terms of submission or putting that information together prior to submission, you can reach out to any of us. We can help to a degree. If you have questions specifically about Click and how to use Click, Tracy's a great resource for that as well. But we are here to help you get this done. So once you submit for review, the agreement will go to internal review. And as I said earlier, it will route to the appropriate office. So most of the time we can tell just based on the type of agreement it is, who and who is funding it, which office is going to review it. In those gray areas, we'll handle it on the back end about who's going to review it. You don't need to spend any mental energy figuring that out. Sometimes after you submit, you'll get an email that says clarification is required or something along those lines. Sometimes when we're reviewing, clarifications are needed from the study team so that we can have better direction about which way to go with the agreement. This will most often happen when there's not sufficient information input during the submission process. So we need more information before we start drafting or reviewing an agreement. You will be notified. When you do get notified, access the agreement, quickly review the request and make any necessary changes and submit that. You can track the progress of your agreement as it moves through the review and approval workflow within Click, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. And then one of the questions that we get all the time is, what do we do with amendments? So this is a bit of a change as well. Historically, amendments have been a little all over the place as well. I know that the clinical research side of the house tracked amendments in Click. I'm not sure exactly what tech transfer's status on that is, and if Jennifer wants to chime in from the hallway, she's welcome to.
We do not track amendments in Click because
Okay.
I don't know how to use the amendment features. That's totally a me thing. And normally it comes to me from SPS that there's usually a need for a no cost extension, and it's more work at that point to put it into Click than it is just to hand them the one page that says we now will have everything due on December 15th.
Right. And then for SPS, historically, they have not tracked the amendments in Click either. That's going to be changing. More information will be following on that, but in general, if you have an agreement in Click right now that you need to be amended in some way, there's a button in the top left-hand corner that says create amendment, and then you just follow the same process as you would for submitting a new agreement, but most of it has already been filled out because it's pulling information over from the original agreement. But my recommendation for right now is, if you do have an amendment that's needed, share it. If it's for an agreement that tech transfer is already handled, contact tech transfer about it. If it's for an agreement that either the clinical research office or SPS is handled, contact SPS about it. We will make sure that we point you in the right direction. And then this is just a very quick slide for click agreements. You can follow along with the progress of an agreement from the study team and faculty end. One of the most frequent questions that we get is like, what is the status of this agreement? What's going on with this agreement? You can follow along and see exactly where your agreement is. When you click on the history tab, you can also see the oftentimes the full negotiation history. So this is the first place to check. If you're still not clear where your agreement is after this, then please do contact the agreement owner. But I want to make sure that we have enough time for ShopBlue as well. So I will stop sharing my screen and I will turn it over to Alex here.
Good morning, everyone. Today I'll primarily be talking about ShopBlue requisition as they pertain to research foundation funds and the primary policies that pertain to those. So that would be RF procurement policies and UB purchasing thresholds. So typically any transactions, any procurement transactions that are above $50,000 primarily for services will require a service agreement for research foundation funds. Now, the Research Foundation has its own template that it typically uses for outside suppliers and independent contractors. And the way we typically utilize that is when we receive a transaction through ShopBlue that exceeds that value, we know that we need to execute a contract for those products and services. So without further ado, I'll jump right in this ShopBlue. All right, can everybody see my screen? All right, perfect. So ShopBlue is readily available. If you just type in ShopBlue, it's a Jagger system for the University at Buffalo. It'll take you to this screen. I imagine most people do have a ShopBlue login because it's required to approve transactions both for sponsored projects, principal investigators, typically the grant owner approval to approve transaction in that system. But if anybody doesn't have access to the system, please let me know. So typically, my screen may be a little different just because I'm a buyer approver, but for the most part, you'll see most of these transactions here. So just a brief overview of what's everything on this screen, right? So we'll start with punch outs. Punch outs down here, you can order a variety of items that are on state contract, like through Fisher Scientific. It basically functions like if you go to an Amazon or like any online shopping format, it'll take you to their website. You can type in a particular catalog that you're looking for, put it in your cart, and when you're ready to check out, it's going to automatically create a requisition for you and go through that process. Non-catalog items. So for when you're looking to purchase something that's not necessarily on a punch out or not necessarily on New York State contract, no contract with the Research Foundation or anything like that, kind of a one-off supplier, you can issue a non-catalog order, which is probably your standard requisition process, right? So for example, what's a common vendor that's not on contract? Now, I believe Agilent is on contract for a variety of items, but they're the ones at the top of my head right now, so I'm going to use them as an example. So for Research Foundation, typically the fulfillment centers that you'll be looking for is a 030 number. So we'll be using the 030 Wilmington address in this instance. That's right. Usually when there's several fulfillment centers, it doesn't, you don't see the prompt down here, but you sort of provide a general description of the item. So if we're purchasing a particular reagent, we'll say biochemical, catalog number SKU 01. We want 5 of these at $100 a piece. It's going to automatically create a requisition in your shopping cart up here. And you go to checkout, and this process generally familiar, if you ever use Shop Blue, you would fill out your ship to information. The bill to address will be, there's two bill to options, one if you're using UBF funds and one if you're using state and RF funds. You would select the one for UBF and RF. So just an example right here. You have UBF bill to and UB bill to. That's the one we'll be primarily using this morning. And from here on in, you select the appropriate buyer commodity. So if we are looking for, in this particular instance, we're looking to purchase a biochemical. I know that one used to be a commodity, but I think they've since removed that one. Probably the most appropriate would be laboratory scientific consumable supplies, others. And it'll tell you who that buyer is and who that requisition will go to. From there on in down here, you would choose your funding source. So for Research Foundation, we're going to select R. And you enter the corresponding PTA information over here. The award information will, the end date will auto-populate depending on what you enter here. And then your expenditure major and expenditure minor. If you have any questions or concerns about this, I believe Sponsored Projects generally has this information right available. They can see where basically the budget lines are allocated to. But if we were ordering general supplies, supplies might be an option. Class lab, just as an example. And obviously I don't have any PTA information in here, but if we did, it would create a workflow over here and you see everyone who's associated with that particular grant. So who the purchaser, who the buyer is, who the principal investigator is, the grant owner who would approve it, and the sponsored projects representative that would be approving it. Any general questions about Shop Blue?
So Alex, I actually have one.
Sure.
Who is the sponsored projects representative that would approve this?
It would be whoever the award analyst is for that particular PTA. So like a lot of times I work with Sunny. I know there's a lot of new names, Michael.
There are, yeah.
Their information would show up there.
Okay.
So that's just sort of a general overview for non-catalog. I apologize if I'm moving fast, just because I do want to go through the service agreement portion as well. Okay, so back to the main Shop Blue screen. We can do the special requests forms are down here. Typically, the one that we would prefer to utilize for service agreements would be the standing order request form. So the standing order request form will allow you to make multiple payments over the course of a year. Typically, we only set these up for a year at a time, even if a service agreement is, let's say, for 5 years, right? So the particular service agreement might be for $200,000, but generally grants are reviewed on an annual basis, so we only enter these for a year at a time. So let's say we're looking to execute a service agreement for $100,000 for a 12-month period. If you click on the standing order form, it'll prompt you to enter some information similar to the non-catalog item, but it'll ask for some additional information like time spans, justification if it's over a certain dollar amount, and things of that nature. So a lot of times if a researcher is from a different organization, they transfer from another university, they may have an ongoing project and the supplier or independent contractor who they've been working with isn't set up in Shop Blue. In that instance, you would enter a new supplier and select this particular option. The distribution method, that's typically handled by procurement services. Basically, what this means is Shop Blue is designated to automatically send out a PO to a supplier on an ongoing basis. But if it's for one or very large dollar amount, we typically handle that as a one-off and don't do a distribution. We'll do it manual. The start date is for the time period that you're looking to have the services for. So if we're doing a 12-month period, we'll do October 16th, today's date, to October, typically it's 1 day before. If it's a contract, because that's when the contract technically expires, is 11/59 the following day. But that's typically you would have the standing order cover at least one contract year, or if it's a 1-year contract, the full term of the agreement. Is this request replacing an existing PO? So if we are doing a new standing order for a 5-year agreement, we would say yes. And then we would enter the last PO number that was generated for this particular service. If this is the first time we're doing this service, we'll select no. And for this particular example, it'll just be a 1-year agreement. Justification. So it's sort of a brief overview of the services that we are pursuing. So let's say we have a consultant that's helping us with laboratory analysis work, right? So we could do say consultant services for lab work. Now, depending on the dollar amount, we may look for additional information like a single source justification or competitive quotes if it's something that's feasible. A lot of times, if it's continuation of work, we can't necessarily solicit competitive quotes, right? Because we've been working with a particular vendor. We've been buying a particular reagent. We can't switch in the middle of the project. So it would be a single source justification in that instance, right? So for this example, we'll proceed with the assumption that it is in fact a single source justification. If you have any additional attachments, for example, you have an agreement that was provided by the consultant, you have a statement of work, single source justification, a quote, an estimate, or anything like that. If you have their W-9, that's definitely beneficial. If not, procurement services will solicit that from the contact that you provide, just because we need to get their vendor ID information in order to get them paid eventually. So that's what you would attach there. So item, typically, if it's services, you can provide a brief description of the services. So we'll say consulting services, and we'll do this for $100,000 for a 12-month period. That should be all the information that we need at this point in time. So once you enter that general information, okay, that's the previous non-catalog order. We'll focus on the standing order here. Once you have all this information, it's going to generate this overview of what you just entered. So $100,000 for consulting services with a new supplier. We'll proceed to checkout. So in this particular instance, it captured that previous non-catalog order that I had here. So if you have multiple, let's say if you were working on multiple requisitions in your cart, this is something that would happen. For this example, I'll remove Agilent Technologies from here. Okay. Seems as though I accidentally deleted the previous requisition. So let me run through that real quick for a service agreement. New supplier. Contract for 1 year. This is a new purchase order. Consulting services, some justification, item for $100,000. My apologies, but that does serve as a good example just in case you have multiple items in your cart, what could happen. So once we have an overview of this information, we'll proceed to checkout. And this looks similar to as if we're doing a non-catalog order or a punch-out order, same information. So we'll start with the business purpose. Generally, it'll be organized research. Ship to. Usually your personal information will auto-populate here, but if not, you'll be able to select various locations across UB. If you don't see your information here readily available, you can type in North Campus or South Campus, your particular building. So we'll do, say, Bell Hall, room 224. Requested delivery date. This isn't necessarily required unless you have a particular date that you need it by. The bill to information will be the UB option. And for the buyer commodity, you would typically select what's most appropriate for these services. So these are consulting services. You can type in consulting, and then consulting and professional services comes up as a commodity. You'll see that I'm listed as the buyer, so this requisition will come to me for review. So down here, we would enter the appropriate PTA information. So it won't let me submit this requisition because I don't have any particular PTA to work with. But if you do have that information, and you populate all that, that should be all that's required from you at this point in time. It will then give you an option to place the order up here. The first step that it's going to go to is purchasing for review. We'll make the determination that because it's $100,000, above $50,000, we'll need to pursue a service agreement, and we'll do that on your behalf. Any questions at this point in time? So, because I don't have the PTA information, it won't let me submit this requisition, but once we do that, it'll go through the appropriate workflow. And then if we have any additional questions, we'll contact the requisitioner or the PI that's associated with the grant. So
Perfect. Thank you, Alex.
Yep, no problem. And just if anybody has any questions or concerns about the policies, the primary policies that we work with are the RF procurement policy. This is readily available if you Google RF procurement policy. Same thing with UB purchasing threshold and what's required at each dollar amount.
So I'm glad that Alex brought up the policy, because that's actually a great this was not planned, but this is actually a great transition to the next slide. So here, I'm just going to share my screen real quick. Alex just shared with you the policy for Research Foundation procurement, and I think that's a really good thing to keep in the back of your head about to help inform where to go. So Alex's office is going to look at things in light of that policy for our procurement. Like why does that exist? So there's a procurement policy to avoid self-dealing and corruption, making sure that we get the best price. And that's why Alex's office exists, is to make sure that we're adhering to what the policies are and making sure that we're avoiding, non-compliant transactions, that we're avoiding situations where, money gets lost. And then when you think about sponsor projects, contracts office, and tech transfer, we're looking at it from a slightly different angle, but very similar. So in both cases, we are looking at it from the scope of how can we ensure that, number one, we are managing risk appropriately for the Research Foundation. The Research Foundation is a corporate entity with insurance policies, so we need to make sure that we're not taking huge unfounded risks without the appropriate approvals in our agreement. So we've got to make sure that the terms in those agreements are aligned with the risk profile of the Research Foundation. So that keeping why the offices exist in the back of your head will help inform which offices you should go to when you have questions. So as a general rule, there are exceptions to every rule, but as a general rule, ask yourself the question, does the contract involve generating new knowledge, testing a hypothesis, are conducting a systematic investigation with the primary goal of contributing to generalizable knowledge. If the answer is yes, that contract is likely for a research project and should be submitted to click agreements. If it's not, ask whether the contract primarily involves obtaining goods, equipment, or services to support existing operations without generating new knowledge. Then it's likely a contract for the purchase of goods or services and should probably go through Shop Blue. But consider services and testing agreements. Jennifer, do you have anything to add about services and testing agreements?
I will once I unmute. Okay, so services and testing agreements. If you're, as Connor pointed out, if you're procuring them, it goes through procurement. If you're providing those testing and services agreements, those would go through click. So
Thank you.
simple, right?
And those would most likely, obviously there's not hard and fast rules and everything, but probably would go through tech transfer, correct?
Yeah, more likely than not, it would end up in tech transfer. As you know, the minute you create a role, there are the 8 million exceptions. For example,
Right.
if they involve human subjects research, it becomes an SPS thing.
In general, if you have questions, you can contact any of our offices. I just put the email for our office there in SPS, but we, as we said earlier, we work collaboratively behind the scenes to make sure that you get where you need to go. But best practices for faculty and staff, learn how to navigate Click, learn the steps for creating agreements, amendments, and responding to clarifications. That training can be provided by Tracy Groves in Research Information Systems. I have a QR code down here in the bottom left-hand corner that will bring you directly to that site. Learning how to navigate Shop Blue. There's a Shop Blue training link in the QR code on the right as well. Learning how to engage the right office will prevent delays by contacting the correct office early. And then, as I mentioned already, Tracy Groves and Research Information Systems, when you have questions on how to use the software itself for either Click or Shop Blue, there are training resources available provided at the links below. Jennifer and Alex, did I miss anything?
I don't believe so. I guess if there could come up with questions as you leave, you can always contact me or Connor or Alex, and we'll be happy to answer them.
All right, so this is now the Q&A portion. If there are any additional questions, we're happy to answer them. But I want to thank Jennifer and Alex for joining me. Originally, this was supposed to be a Connor Flynn presentation, but we could not do it without involving tech transfer and procurement as well, because we're all doing the same thing, and support for faculty and staff to know that. So thank you to Jennifer and Alex for joining. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Any questions from the group? We are here as a resource, so ask away.
I do want to note, as people start to log off, I did leave a link for a survey in the chat. I'm going to ask that you guys all click the link before you log off to make sure you can take the survey. Right now, I don't have any questions in the chat.
All right, sounds good. Well, I know that all of you have all of our emails because I talk to many of you on a regular basis. So don't be shy. Don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you, Marshall, for the invite.
Thank you guys for presenting.
Thanks,
Thanks
guys.
for having us. Bye.